Detectives may have gotten the break they've been looking for in a decades-old cold case in Tacoma.
Today, police announced the arrest of a man in connection with the 1986 murder of Michelle Welch. KOMO's Steve McCarran has more from Tacoma, where Michella's body was found 32 years ago.
It was the last week of March, spring break. The trees hadn't come back yet. The branches in the parks were still bare, stripped down to bark and open sky. The way they are in that stretch of the year when the calendar says spring and the weather hasn't agreed to it. And the kids were out of school. You have to understand what that meant in 1986, because it's genuinely a different country from the one we live in now. Children rode bikes across town without telling anyone the route. They cut through wooded lots. They knocked on doors. They came home when the streetlights came on, and that was the whole system. There were no cell phones. There was no checking in. Parents went to work, and their kids were simply out in the world for 8 or 9 hours, and nobody thought twice about it. That isn't neglect. That's just what childhood was. Every adult watching this who grew up in that era knows exactly what I'm describing, because you lived it, and you came home fine. In the north end of Tacoma, in a residential neighborhood of modest houses and quiet blocks, there's a place called Puget Park. At street level, it looks like any other city park. Playground equipment, a picnic area, bike racks, houses close enough that you can see front porches from the swings. But Puget Park sits on the lip of something else. Directly below it, the ground falls away into a gulch, a deep, wooded ravine, wild and overgrown, cut through with dirt trails and crossed overhead by the Proctor Bridge. It doesn't feel like city green space. It feels like somewhere else entirely, somewhere that belongs miles outside of town. And this is the detail that matters most in this story, so I want to be precise about it. You can be standing in that playground, surrounded by houses, in the middle of a neighborhood, in the middle of the day, and if you walk downhill into that gulch, within about 60 seconds, you are completely out of sight, out of earshot. Invisible from every window on that street. The geography of Puget Park is not background. The geography of Puget Park is the crime. And one more thing about this city, which I'll mention once and then set aside. Tacoma is where Ted Bundy grew up. He rode these streets as a boy. Whatever it is that we tell ourselves about where evil comes from and why it chooses one place over another, Tacoma had already learned it didn't get to choose. On the morning of March 26, 1986, 3 sisters came to Puget Park. The oldest was 12 years old, a 6th grader. She was small for her age, petite, long blonde hair, a pair of glasses. Her name was Michelle Welch. The 2 younger girls were Angela and Nicole. Nicole was 9. Their mother, Barbara, was raising 3 daughters and working, which meant that a great deal of the day-to-day fell to the girl at the top of the birth order. And Michella had grown into that job without anyone ever formally handing it to her. That happens sometimes with oldest children. Life asks a little more of them a little earlier than it should, and they simply rise to meet it and never mention it again. She was the one who kept track of where the bikes were. The one who noticed when something was missing. The one who counted heads without being asked to count heads. And the 3 of them had something between them. A private call. It wasn't a word, exactly. It was a sound. A signal the sisters had made up somewhere back in early childhood, the way siblings do. A noise that belonged only to them. And the rule of it was simple. Wherever you were, whichever corner of the yard or the house or the park you'd wandered off into, if you heard it, you answered it. It always got an answer. That was the entire point of it. In all the years the 3 of them had used it, it had never once failed. Remember that. The morning itself was completely ordinary. Barbara had gone to work. The girls had permission to spend a couple of hours at Puget Park before their piano lessons that afternoon. The studio was right across the street from the park, which is why they were there at all. It was a place the family went so often that going there had stopped registering as a decision. You didn't plan it, you just went. And then, somewhere around the middle of the day, the girls realized they'd made a small mistake. They'd left their lunch at home. It's nothing. It's the smallest problem a person can have. And Michella was the one who noticed it, and Michella was the one who volunteered to fix it. She didn't ask her sisters to come with her. She got on her bike, alone, and pedaled home. She made the sandwiches herself, wrapped them up, put them in a plain brown paper bag, the kind of bag nobody would ever look at twice. Then she got back on that bike, with lunch for the three of them, and rode all the way back to Puget Park. And I want to be very clear about this next part, because it's the piece people forget when they retell this case. She made it. She got there. 10 a.m., Puget Park. 11 a.m., Michella rides home. Sometime after that, and this is the first place the clock gets slippery, she comes back. She rides in, gets off her bike, and chains it up in the rack next to her sister's bike. Exactly where it always goes. Exactly the way she always does it. She carries the brown paper bag to the picnic table and sets it down. Lunch for three, and the park is empty of the two people she came back for. Because while she was gone, Angela and Nicole had needed a bathroom. Around 12:30, the two of them walked out of the park and down the street to a nearby business to use the restroom there. They came back around 1 o'clock and went right back to playing, down in the gulch, near a small cave under the bridge, the way kids do. So the timing works out to something almost unbearable in how small it is. Michella came back to a park that, for a stretch of maybe 20 or 30 minutes, had no one in it who was looking for her. She left the bag on the table, and she went to find her sisters. She never came back to that table. The window in which Michelle Welch disappears is not measured in hours. It is measured in minutes. Here is what people would later tell police they saw that day. A 13-year-old classmate of Michella's was in the park that morning. She told detectives there was a man there, under the Proctor Bridge, at the edge of the gulch, watching them. Not passing through, watching. Her account, as it appears in the case timeline, is specific in a way that's hard to shake. She said the man was under the bridge when they first noticed him. Then he came into the park. Then he went back under the bridge for 5 or 10 minutes. Then he came out again and stood there and kept staring at them. And when he started to walk toward them, the girls decided they'd had enough, and they left, heading up toward Michella's house. She described him as a white male, mid-20s, around 5'9", thin, a blue jean jacket with holes worn through it. Blue jeans. Dirty, ripped white tennis shoes. Police built a composite sketch from that description. That man was never identified. There were other reports. An employee from Michella's school told investigators she drove past Puget Park somewhere between 1 and 1:30 and saw Michella there, and around 1:30 in the afternoon, Michella was reportedly seen for the last time, standing and talking with a man who was pointing down a trail that led into the gulch. The description of that man doesn't match the one under the bridge. Different height, different age range, different everything. Which is its own kind of problem, and one investigators would live with for the next 3 decades. But I want to slow down on the image itself, because I think people move past it too quickly. A 12-year-old girl is looking for her little sisters. She's worried. She's been gone maybe an hour, and they aren't where she left them. And an adult points down a path and, in whatever words he used, tells her they went that way. That is not a trick a child can see through. There's no version of a 12-year-old catching that. She wasn't careless, and she wasn't naive. She was doing exactly what she'd done her whole life, which was looking after her sisters. An adult took her decency and used it as a door. Around 2 o'clock, Angela and Nicole came up out of the gulch and back to the picnic area. And what they found was Michella's bike chained neatly next to theirs, and the brown paper bag sitting on the table with the sandwiches inside. Everything her, nothing of her. They waited. Of course they waited. A big sister who's been gone a little while is not an emergency. She got sidetracked. She ran into someone. She'll turn up in a minute, the way big sisters always do. She didn't turn up. So the girls walked to the edge of the gulch, and they did the thing the three of them had done their entire lives. They used the call, That sound that belonged only to the three of them. The one that always got an answer. From anywhere, every single time. They stood at the edge of that ravine, and they sent it down into the trees. And nothing came back. They called it again. Nothing came back. Two little girls, 9 years old and younger, then started down a trail into the gulch by themselves, looking for their sister. Their babysitter arrived and called them back out. The babysitter contacted Barbara. Barbara contacted police. At 3:10 that afternoon, the first officers arrived at Puget Park and went down into the gulch. What follows is the part of these cases that never makes it into the retelling, because it isn't dramatic, it's just long. It's hours. Officers working a ravine in a residential neighborhood, moving through blackberry and brush and trails that fold back on themselves, neighbors coming out of their houses to help, family members walking the streets around the park, calling her name, and nobody says the word out loud yet. Not abduction. Nobody says that in the afternoon, in a city park, 3 blocks from home. She's lost. She wandered. She's at a friend's. She's fine. Search and rescue units are brought in, and the light starts going, because it's the end of March in the Pacific Northwest, and the dark comes down early, and it comes down completely. By evening, they're searching a wooded ravine by flashlight. Barbara Welch spends those hours doing what any mother would do, which I'm not going to describe, because it belongs to her. At 11:27 that night, more than 8 hours after the first officers walked into the park, a search and rescue dog located Michella. She was in an isolated part of the gulch, in a fire pit area, more than a quarter of a mile from the picnic table where she'd left the sandwiches. She had been sexually assaulted. The medical examiner determined she died of blunt force trauma to the head. That's all I'm going to say about it. It's all anyone needs to know, and it's all she'd want said. She was 12 years old. She had been alive that morning, and had ridden her bike home, and had made lunch for her sisters, and back up at the top of the gulch at the picnic table, in a park now full of police lights and radios, and adults who had run out of things to say, the brown paper bag was still sitting there. Untouched, exactly where she'd set it down. Remember that bag. It's going to matter again in 32 years. Tacoma did not go back to normal. You can chart it in the small things. Parents who had never once thought about it started driving their kids the 2 blocks to school. The shortcut through the trees stopped being a shortcut and became a place you didn't go. Kids who had spent their whole lives being told to be home by dark were now being told to be home, period, and to call from wherever they were, and to stay where an adult could see them. An entire generation of Tacoma childhood contracted overnight, and it never fully expanded again. The composite sketch went everywhere. The thin man in the torn denim jacket, drawn from a 13-year-old girl's description of the figure under the Proctor Bridge. It ran in the newspapers. It went up on flyers in shop windows. It aired on the local news. Nobody recognized him. Not one person. The tips came anyway. Thousands of them. Detectives worked the case relentlessly, and I want to give them their due here, because a lot of true crime storytelling treats a cold case as evidence that nobody cared. That is not what happened in Tacoma. In the first year alone, investigators logged more than 10,000 hours on this. 10,000 hours. And at the end of it, they were exactly where they'd started. And then it happened again. August 4th, 1986. A Monday afternoon in the middle of summer break. A 13-year-old girl named Jennifer Bastion left her house on North Winifred Street. Her family called her Jenny. She was the younger of 2 daughters. Her parents were Patty and Ralph, and she had an older sister, Teresa. Her family described her as a bundle of energy. Cartwheels, swimming, gymnastics. The kind of kid who was friends with everybody, because it never occurred to her not to be. And that summer, Jenny had a project. She'd signed up for a Yimka bicycle tour through the San Juan Islands, and she was determined to be ready for it. So she trained. Nearly every day she took Her Schwinn out and rode, usually 30 blocks or so, up to Point Defiance Park, one of the largest urban parks in the country, with a winding road called 5 Mile Drive, looping through old-growth forest along the water. She normally rode with friends. On August 4th, none of them were free. Asked permission. She got it, and before she left, she did the thing that tells you everything about the kind of kid she was. She wrote a note for her family, so they wouldn't worry. She'd be home by 6:30. She left around 2:30 in the afternoon. Witnesses saw her in the park, riding, stopping, drinking from her water bottle. She told people she was training for a bike tour. Credible sightings put her out on 5 Mile Drive as late as 6 o'clock that evening. 6:30 came. Jenny didn't. The Bastions called her friends. They called neighbors. Then they called the police. And by that night there were officers and a bloodhound working Point Defiance Park. The search that followed was enormous. Hundreds of people, volunteers walking the trails in lines. And on the third day of it, Barbara Welch, Michella's mother, 5 months out from burying her 12-year-old, came and found Patty Bastion. I don't know exactly what one of those women said to the other, but I know that in the summer of 1986, in one city, there were 2 mothers who understood each other completely, and I don't think there's a lonelier club than that. They didn't find Jenny. Not that week. Not that month. On August 26th, a jogger running a trail off 5 Mile Drive reported a strong odor to park police. 2 days later, August 28th, 24 days after she left home, she was found in a wooded area off that road, deliberately concealed under piled brush. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled. Now put the 2 cases side by side, the way every detective in Tacoma did in the fall of 1986. 2 girls, 12 and 13, both blonde, both taken in broad daylight, in a city park, in the north end of the same town, both connected to bicycles, both sexually assaulted, both concealed in wooded terrain off a trail, 5 months apart, 3 miles apart. There is no investigator in America who looks at that and concludes anything other than the obvious. 1 man, 2 girls. So they merged the investigations. They merged the files. They merged the suspect pools. A task force worked both as a single problem, because that is what the evidence plainly said it was. And every decision made in either case, every theory, every suspect prioritized, every name written down and every name crossed off, was built on that one foundation for the next 30 years. It was wrong. It was completely, catastrophically wrong, and nobody on Earth would know it for almost 3 decades. Here's the part that's hardest to sit with. Physical evidence was collected at both scenes in 1986. Careful, professional, properly preserved evidence, including biological material. The answer was in it. The answer had been in it from day one. But in 1986, DNA profiling barely existed. That same year, on the other side of the Atlantic, a laboratory in England was using a brand new technique called DNA fingerprinting on a murder investigation for the very first time in history. It was a scientific novelty. It was not a tool a police department in Washington state could pick up and use. So the evidence went into a freezer, and it sat there, complete, intact, holding a name, for 20 years. In 2006, technicians finally built a full male DNA profile from the evidence in Michella's case. 20 years after her death, detectives finally had their killer's genetic fingerprint in hand. They ran it through CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database. Millions of profiles from convicted offenders across the country. No match. Not a partial, not a maybe. Nothing. Because whoever killed Michelle Welch had never been convicted of anything that would put his DNA in that system. And that meant that to the single most powerful tool law enforcement had ever been handed, he simply did not exist. He wasn't hiding. He was invisible. 2 dead girls, 1 perfect profile, and a database that had never heard of him. She was 11 years old in 1986. Lindsay Wade, grew up in Tacoma. She was the exact age of the girls in those parks, old enough to understand what had happened, old enough to hear the adults talking, and old enough to change her own behavior because of it. She has written about it since, plainly. After that year, you thought twice about where you rode your bike. You thought twice about which path you took to school. That's the thing about crimes like these. They don't only take the child, they take something out of every child in the city who hears about them. In high school, Wade read a book about Ted Bundy, the killer who had grown up on those same Tacoma streets. And where that book might have given another teenager nightmares, it gave her a career plan. She decided she wanted to solve crimes and take men like that off the street. She joined the Tacoma Police Department. 6 years in patrol, then 14 years as a detective, working violent crime, sex crimes, child abuse, missing persons, homicides. And there's a detail from those years that I want you to hold on to, because it tells you exactly what kind of investigator we're dealing with. While working an unrelated cold case, Wade discovered something almost impossible to believe. Ted Bundy's DNA was not in CODIS. The most notorious serial killer in American history, executed in 1989, and his genetic profile simply wasn't in the national database. So she tracked down a sample through the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and got it uploaded. That happened in 2011. That's the woman who ends up with these files. Tacoma had formed a cold case unit in 2009, built by a detective named Gene Miller. Miller saw something in Wade and brought her in. By the end, she was the department's cold case detective, personally responsible for roughly 150 unsolved homicides and long-term missing persons cases. Among them, Michelle Welch and Jennifer Bastion. What she inherited was paper, dozens of binders, 30 years of reports, interviews, tips, and dead ends, accumulated by generations of detectives who had retired or died without ever getting an answer. And out of that mountain, Wade built something nobody had ever built before. She compiled a master list of every male whose name appeared anywhere in either investigation, for any reason at all. Suspects, persons of interest, witnesses, tipsters, men who had simply been in the vicinity and gotten written down. 2,300 names. Think about the premise underneath that list. The man who killed Michelle Welch is, statistically, almost certainly on it. He is somewhere in those 2,300 names, and there is no way on earth to know which one. In 2015 and 2016, the cold case team brought in a company called Parabon Nanolabs to try something new: DNA phenotyping. Building a predicted physical composite of an unknown suspect directly from his genetic material, skin tone, eye color, hair color, ancestry, computer-generated faces grown from evidence. The images went public in both cases. More tips came in. Every one of them was a dead end. So Wade went back to the list. She narrowed 2,300 down to a few hundred higher probability names and started asking men to voluntarily give a DNA sample. 160 of them said yes. The samples went off to the lab in batches. Batch after batch came back with nothing. But something else had already changed the entire shape of the case. In 2013, at the recommendation of an expert panel from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, Wade and Miller made a decision that everyone before them had passed on. They sent Jennifer Bastion's swimsuit for testing, an item long assumed to be useless. It yielded male DNA. For the first time in 27 years, both cases had a profile. And when the lab put the two profiles side by side, the answer came back in an afternoon. They didn't match. Two different men. Not one predator working two parks. Two unconnected strangers who each took a child within 3 miles of each other in the same 5 months of the same year, and then walked back into ordinary life and stayed there. Every theory, every merged file, every suspect ever prioritized because he fit both crimes. 30 years of investigative architecture, resting on a foundation that had never existed, and neither profile matched anyone in CODIS. Now, Remember the tip. May of 1986, a man calls Tacoma police to say he'd been jogging in Point Defiance Park and had seen someone matching the sketch of Michella's killer. That man's name was on Wade's list of 2,300, and it stayed there for a reason that turned out to matter enormously. A forensic genealogist working the case had given detectives a list of possible surnames drawn from the DNA, and his surname was on it. So when Wade selected men for voluntary DNA collection, she included him. He agreed. No hesitation. Wade sent her final 18 samples to the lab shortly before she retired from the Tacoma Police Department in April of 2018, after 21 years. Within a month of walking out of that building, her phone rang. A detective from the cold case unit. One of those last 18 samples had matched Jennifer Bastion's case. The name was Robert Washburn, the man who had called police in 1986 to help find one girl's killer, had, 3 months after that phone call, taken the other. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 27 years. And Michella still had no name. Which brings us to the tool that would finally get one. And it works in a way most people still find slightly unbelievable. Investigative genetic genealogy doesn't need the killer in a database. It needs his third cousin in one. You take the crime scene DNA, generate a detailed genetic profile from it, and upload it to public genealogy databases, the same ones ordinary people use to find relatives. You're not looking for a match. You're looking for distant cousins. Then you build their family trees outward, backward to shared ancestors, and forward again, filtering by sex, by age, by who actually lived in the right city in the right year. You triangulate a stranger out of his own relatives. In February 2017, a full year before the world had heard of any of this, Lindsay Wade began working Michella's profile with a genetic genealogist named Barbara Ray Venter. If that name means anything to you, it's because Ray Venter is the woman who, in 2018, would help identify the Golden State Killer and make genetic genealogy a household phrase. She was quietly working Michelle Welch's case first. Ray Venter and a second genealogist, Nancy Averill, uploaded the profile and began building. The tree converged on two cousins on different branches of the same family, and from there onto two brothers with ties to Tacoma's North End in 1986. The surname was Hartman. Then, in May 2018, something remarkable happened. Parabon Nanolabs, whose genetic genealogy unit was led by C.C. Moore, working entirely separately and without knowledge of Ray Venter's results, ran their own analysis of Michella's DNA. They landed on the same two cousins, and then the same two brothers. Two independent teams, two independent methods, one family. And there the investigation hit a wall, because genealogy can narrow you to a household and then stops. It cannot tell you which brother, and there was nowhere near enough evidence to get a warrant compelling either man to give a sample, which left detectives with exactly one option. They would have to wait for one of them to throw something away. By June of 2018, Gary Charles Hartman was 66 years old. He lived quietly on a lake in Lakewood, just south of Tacoma. He collected vintage cars. He drove to work like clockwork. Neighbors would later describe him as cordial and easygoing, the sort of man you wave to from your driveway without a second thought, because there has never once been a reason to think anything else. He had no criminal record. None. Not a conviction, not an arrest, nothing. And for more than 2 decades, he had worked as a community nurse specialist at Western State Hospital, a psychiatric facility, helping patients who were being discharged transition back into ordinary life. The hospital confirmed he had never received a single disciplinary mark in all that time. He had also never met Michelle Welch. There was no connection between them, no grudge, no history, no relationship of any kind. He was simply a man who was in that park on that day. And this is the thing I want to be very clear about, because it's the whole engine of this case. Gary Hartman was uncatchable for 32 years for exactly one reason. He was ordinary. Nothing about him ever generated a record. He passed background checks, he was licensed by the state to care for vulnerable people, and in 2018, ordinary finally stopped being enough to hide behind, because the search had stopped looking for criminals and started looking for families. Detective Steve Riopel had been following him for weeks. Riopel would later admit there were stretches of that surveillance where he genuinely thought the match was never going to come. You sit in a car, you sit in restaurants 10 feet from a man, you wait for him to be careless with something, and most days, he isn't. June 5, 2018. Hartman goes to work at Western State Hospital, the same as any other day. Afterward, he stops at a nearby restaurant to have breakfast with a coworker. He orders, he eats, he talks, and at some point, the way anyone does with eggs or toast, he wipes his mouth with a brown paper napkin. He does it more than once. Then he crumples the napkin up, puts it into a bag, crumples the bag, and leaves it behind on the table as he stands up and walks out. Riopel asks the restaurant for the napkin. He takes it straight to the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory. 32 years, 2 crime labs. A federal database of millions, more than 10,000 investigative hours in the first year alone, a list of 2,300 names, 2 independent genealogy teams, and a family tree built out of strangers. And in the end, it came down to whether a man wiped his mouth. The lab result came back. The DNA on that napkin matched the DNA recovered from Michelle Welch in 1986. And there's one more piece to this, which I still find difficult to sit with. In the days before his arrest, Hartman seems to have sensed the surveillance. He told a coworker that 30 years ago he had done something terrible, and that he thought he had finally been found out. He knew they were coming. He sat down for breakfast anyway, and he left that napkin on the table anyway. June 20th, 2018. Police pull him over in a traffic stop in Lakewood and take him into custody. He's charged with first-degree murder and first-degree rape. Bail is set at $5 million. Barbara Leonard, Michella's mother, comes to the courthouse and sees him for the first time, sitting there in jail scrubs. What she said afterward has stayed with me. You never expect the face of someone who has done something this terrible to look so completely, unremarkably normal. Take away the scrubs, she said, and he just looked like anyone. He pleads not guilty, and he holds that line for years. But at some point, in a cell in the Pierce County Jail, something gave way. His own defense attorney would later tell the court that Hartman simply woke up one day and accepted the thing he had spent decades convincing himself wasn't true. The DNA had made the lie impossible to keep living inside of. March 22, 2022. Pierce County Superior Court. Gary Hartman is 70 years old now. He comes into the courtroom using a walker. He has requested a bench trial. No jury, just a judge. His defense stipulates to so much of the evidence that the prosecutor tells the court he has done everything he possibly could, short of pleading guilty outright. It is over in less than 2 hours. Guilty of first-degree murder. Then the family speaks. Barbara Leonard tells the court to lock him up and throw away the key. It won't bring Michella back, but justice, finally, will have been done. And then Nicole stands up. The 9-year-old who once walked to the edge of that gulch and sent the family call down into the trees and got nothing back. She is a grown woman now, and what she says stops the room. She forgives him. And she adds that forgiveness is not the same thing as forgetting, that it's choosing to remember without carrying the pain of it any longer. A written statement from Michella's aunt, Linda McGuire, is read into the record. The worst and most devastating event her family ever lived through, leaving a hole in their lives that nothing has ever filled. Hartman's attorneys tell the court about the man he'd been in 1986, struggling, addicted, and about the man he became after getting sober in 1989 and building a career in nursing. Hartman sits through all of it with his head in his hands, crying harder with every voice. When the judge gives him his turn, all he manages is that he's sorry, that God knows he's sorry, that it doesn't help. Judge Stanley Rumbaugh is not moved by the mitigation. He tells Hartman plainly that there are no excusing conditions for what he did, that whatever his life has looked like since March of 1986, none of it softens or erases it, and that he is guilty of one of the most depraved crimes that court has seen. Then he imposes 320 months, 26 and a half years, the absolute maximum the law allowed for a crime committed in 1986. Hartman is serving that sentence at Airway Heights Corrections Center in eastern Washington. The judge said what everyone in the room already understood. He will almost certainly die there. There's one last thing these two girls left behind. Lindsay Wade, retired now, went to work with both families, including Jennifer's mother, Patty Bastion, who had been testifying in front of state legislators for years and was determined to keep doing it until somebody listened. It took 4 years of hearings, testimony, and setbacks. But in May of 2019, Washington State signed House Bill 1326 into law. It's called Jennifer and Michella's Law. It requires DNA collection from anyone convicted of a felony and from anyone convicted of indecent exposure, an offense that had somehow never been on the list, and one investigators will tell you is frequently a gateway to far worse. It allows DNA from deceased offenders to be entered into the national database, regardless of when they were convicted. It closes, one by one, the exact gaps that let two men stand in plain sight in one city for 30 years. Two girls who never knew each other. Two men who never knew each other. Two parks, 3 miles and 5 months apart, and one law that now carries both of their names. I want to leave you with her, and not with him. She was 12 years old, petite, long blonde hair, a pair of glasses, the oldest of 3 sisters, and the one who had grown into looking after everybody without ever being asked to. It was spring break. Her mother was at work. There was a park across the street from the piano studio, and they'd forgotten their lunch. And Michella was the one who noticed, and Michella was the one who turned around and went back for it. She made the sandwiches herself. She rode all the way back. She set that brown paper bag down on the picnic table. And then she went to find her sisters. Michelle Welch spent the last minutes of her life doing exactly what she had always done, looking after them. One small thing before I go. Those 3 sisters had a call, a sound that belonged only to them, that meant, "Come find me." It costs nothing to give your own kids something like that, and I hope you never need it. If this one stayed with you, tell me in the comments which moment got you. And if you want more cases told this way, slowly, and with the people at the center of them, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Take care of each other.